Okay, welcome to part 2 of our webinar series on pets, parking and more. This is the part of the webinar where we go through questions and answers from the audience. So participants were asked to submit questions when you registered, and we've also had a few questions come through during the presentation part of the webinar. So we'll go through those and answer as many as we can. And I've categorized these to try and keep them consistent and on topic. So first topic is pets. As an owner, how can I ensure my unit is pet-free rental property? In Queensland, you can't ensure this anymore. So in Queensland, as of October 2022, landlords do not have a right to decide that their units are pet-free. In fact, that includes houses as well. So no matter what property type you own, if it's residential and you've got a tenant, you can't have a pet-free rental property. So every landlord now has an obligation to consider every single pet application that they receive, and the grounds for refusal do exist, but they're very limited. So you can't just have a preference against pets. You can only say no to pets in a rental property as a landlord if it meets one of the strict conditions. And those are fairly common sense things, like if the pet is not a domestic pet. So if someone wanted to have a horse in an apartment, you could say no to that. But if they wanted to have a normal domestic pet in an apartment and it was within your either body corporate bylaws or in the case of a house, if there's no body corporate at all, you do have an obligation to allow tenants to keep pets. And that changes why we've seen a lot of changes and a lot of new discussion about how bodies corporate treat pets. So how do I go about making a request for a pet? That request for a pet in body corporate is done to the body corporate committee. If you've got a body corporate manager, such as a BC Systems involved, we'll have a form on our website and you can make an application there. Committees under the law have 6 weeks to get back to each applicant about the outcome of their request. Most committees do it much faster than that, but that's the legal time frame that committees have to decide pet applications and also all other types of decisions that they need to make. Question, what are the chances of getting approved for a second small to medium dog? I thought this obviously is a specific question, but is worthwhile addressing here. Obviously, this questioner already has one dog, so the chance of getting a second dog would be increased if your first dog is well behaved. So if your first dog is not well behaved and it's constantly barking and you're getting breach notices, you probably have no chance of getting a second dog approved. But if you've already demonstrated that you're a responsible pet owner and your second dog is within the approved pet numbers in your local council area, usually the body corporate would need to approve that unless there was some reason why they thought it would be reasonable to say no. Okay, question, a pet is a right, so I talked about that in the webinar, but how do we limit the type of animal, especially a dog? Some are highly aggressive types, yet we don't have regulations around that. So this question about dogs and what type of dog comes up constantly. You don't get it with cats, so I assume all cat types are equally aggressive or not, but dogs, obviously some dogs have a reputation for being dangerous or aggressive. If you're in a local council area where a particular dog breed is restricted or banned, then the body corporate could rely on that and say no to that particular dog breed as long as you're within that local council area. So I don't know the breeds off the top of my head, but if you've got a banned dog breed in Brisbane, it would be reasonable for a body corporate in Brisbane to say, no, you can't have that dog because it's not allowed by council. But a body corporate can't use the breed of dog as the sole indicator of whether they approve it or not. So just because, you know, Rottweilers might have a reputation among some people as being aggressive, doesn't mean the body corporate can base its decision on that factor. Unless that particular dog has a history of being aggressive. So if that, you know, if Freddie the dog has a dangerous dog order and has bitten people before and has to be muzzled, that would be a factor. But the breed generalized is not something that a body corporate can consider. Question, what is constant barking to body corporate? You won't see bylaws that say constant barking. Usually the standard in a bylaw is barking nuisance. So obviously dogs don't bark consistently. When people say, oh, the dog's barking consistently, what they mean is it's barking on and off, but regularly and for a long period of time. So that's just a common sense approach. And if you're a person who's suffering from barking nuisance and you're the person hearing it, not the owner of the dog, it's on you to document what the barking nuisance is. And if you go to a dispute with the dog owner or with the body corporate and say, look, the dog barked 4 times yesterday, that obviously wouldn't be good enough to establish a nuisance. But if you could show that it barked, on and off for a period of 4 hours, very different story. So those sorts of things are very subjective, and it's usually sort of negotiated out by how much the barking is affecting others. If it's bothering you to the extent that you want to go through the process of complaining about it, it probably is a nuisance. But dogs bark, children shout, and people shout and make occasional noise. So that's just part of living in a community. Where it crosses the line, everybody has a different view about where that line is. Question here, what if someone is allergic to pet fur? Is that a legitimate reason for refusal? So if your committee is considering a pet application and someone in the building is allergic to pet fur and that is medically established, that may be a consideration for your committee in either refusing the pet application or approving it with conditions that the pet needs to stay away from that allergic person. So there was a case in Queensland in the last couple of years where a building refused a particular pet because the building's caretaker, so the on-site manager, was allergic to dander, and it was impossible or impracticable for the caretaker not to come into contact with that dog, because the caretaker's job included going to all of the levels of the building and vacuuming them. So it wasn't possible for the caretaker and the dog to stay away from each other. And so on that decision, the adjudicator found it was reasonable for the body corporate to take that into account. But just if you're in a townhouse complex, for example, and the owner of Unit 1 is allergic to pet fur, that doesn't mean nobody in there can have a dog. So there would have to be reasonable balancing of the rights of the person who wants the dog versus the person's health. And importantly, it would need to be medically established. So in that case I referenced, they had a whole lot of medical testing, letters from expert doctors in the field of allergies, and a whole lot of rigmarole in order for that body corporate to get that outcome. You'll usually find, lots of big buildings have someone who either is allergic to cat or dog hair, but if the dog's living on a different floor, it's not going to cause an impact to their daily life. So can be considered, but 9 times out of 10, it wouldn't be a deciding factor for a committee. Still on pets, what about fostering, e.g. a rescue or foster dog? The body corporate law doesn't distinguish how you get the dog or whether it's your dog or not. So if you're fostering a dog or babysitting a dog or whatever you're doing, however you got that dog in there, you're still subject to your building's bylaws, and you would need to go through that pet approval process if that is what your bylaws say. Similar topic to the next question, is it necessary to notify anyone if a visitor brings a dog for a few hours or a few days? If your body corporate has a bylaw that says no pets unless they are approved, your visitor cannot bring the dog into the complex at all, not even for 10 minutes. So the minute a dog comes into the scheme, if that dog is not approved, you're breaching the bylaws. This is again reinforces, the view I expressed during the webinar that your bylaws should be practical. So there's a big difference between a dog visiting for 2 hours versus a dog living there. You usually won't get nuisance issues caused by a visiting dog because they're usually, sitting next to their owner the whole time. And if they do bark at the neighboring cat, they're not there for a very long time, so the nuisance issue goes away. So if you're considering this type of issue in your complex, maybe you have a rule that says, the process for pets exists if you are wanting to have a pet permanently live in the complex, but a pet could visit for up to, 5 days or a certain period of time without needing to go through the approval process. But you still wouldn't want the visitor's dog from swimming in the pool or using the sauna. So you would still have those sort of sensible conditions that are based on the dog and not how long it's there. So question, has a complicated answer, but ultimately look at the bylaws and see if those are appropriate, and if not, look at changing them to something that makes sense. Where do chickens fall in the domestic pet/farm animal divide? I think chickens are still considered a farm animal. They are poultry, they're not a dog or a cat, and I don't think they're a pet. Local councils do allow chickens in a lot of circumstances. I know in Brisbane City Council area, the number of chickens you can have is proportionate to how big your block is. So if you've got a bigger block of land, you can have more chickens. If you were in a high-rise apartment and you wanted to have chickens live on your balcony, I think a body corporate could reasonably say no to that. If you were in a very small townhouse complex, or a townhouse complex with a small courtyard, again, body corporate could probably reasonably say no. Chickens can't really be controlled or trained in the way that a dog or a cat can. And again, you'd have to consider what the bylaws say and what is actually the nuisance that you're trying to affect. Some body corporate communities don't look like townhouses or apartments. So some bodies corporate have big house blocks on the side of the road. There are also big rural body corporate developments with acreage properties in them. So just because you're in a body corporate doesn't mean these rules apply. The rules of each body corporate need to be appropriate based on the type of development that it is. So if you had acreage blocks and a body corporate that dealt with the common area road, well, yeah, that body corporate would probably allow chickens and probably wouldn't cause a problem. Okay, given the waiting period on pet approvals is longer than the quick turnaround of some pet adoption centres, if an owner is planning on getting a pet, is it possible to submit an application for a pet that meets certain conditions rather than a specific animal? So this question again relates to what the bylaw actually says. Most committees, in my experience, will consider an application for an animal type rather than a specific animal. So in this case, if you said, look, I'm going to get, buy a puppy from a rescue centre and it'll be this type of breed and, it'll have its vaccinations and I will register it when I get it, most committees will approve that. And then it will be back on you to prove you've done those steps before you actually bring the dog into the building. That gives you some certainty that you can adopt the dog and not have a refusal later. But often the wording of bylaws is very strict and it relates to a specific animal. So that's where, again, some sensible bylaws can make this problem really go away. Next question is about dog weights. So that 10 kilogram weight limit is one that's very popular. I don't know, I've never really weighed dogs before, but I guess 10 kilograms sounds like a sensible amount of weight for a dog. This is something that bodies corporate cannot consider as a factor in whether a dog is approved or not. So as this person comments, a 9.9 kilogram dog and a 10.1 kilogram dog would have no bearing on how much of a nuisance they are or how well behaved they are in the common areas. So this is something that's arbitrary, like the type of breed of dog, and it's something that should be taken out of bylaws if and when those bylaws are reviewed. Last question on pets, I think, is do I need to get permission to mind a dog for a few days? Yes, you do, same as visiting. I know we've got some more questions on pets. Why is permission for pets required for owner-occupiers? Owner-occupiers and tenants are subject to exactly the same bylaws. The bylaws are not allowed to differentiate between different types. So you can't have rules for owner-occupiers and rules for tenants and rules for visitors. All of the rules need to be appropriate for all types and they apply equally. So if you've got a requirement for tenants to get pet approvals, that requirement also applies to owners. The next one's about pets using common building areas, lawns, gardens, and what are the regulations? Again, back to your bylaws. So if you've got a beautifully manicured, you know, small patch of turf and, you know, lighting and fountains, you probably don't want dogs roaming around on that out the front of your building. But if you've got a large sort of natural landscape area out the back that has some trees and there's like a bush theme, then it might be fine for dogs and cats to roam around in that area and have a bit of fun. So you would write your bylaws to suit the individual areas of your complex. Most buildings have a requirement that the dogs aren't allowed to play in the common property. They certainly would normally be banned from any rooftop areas, you know, pool areas, barbecue areas, that sort of thing. But that can be decided building by building based on your own bylaws. Weight limit we've discussed. What legal rights does the body corporate have in determining rules regarding pets for holiday apartments? So holiday apartment buildings are normal body corporate schemes that obviously have a slightly different use. So they're still residential buildings, but they're short-term residential buildings. Your bylaws in a holiday apartment building would typically be different to a long-term residential body corporate because you have more turnover of residents. They're there for 2 or 3 days at a time, not, you know, 6 or 12 months at a time. So the body corporate can have bylaws, and I would say those just need to be sensible. So if you had a holiday apartment that was appropriate for pets, so if it had, you know, like a 2-bedroom, like a self-service type apartment, pets could probably come in there, stay for a few days and move out, and there would be very low chance of having a long-term issue with a pet just because the owner wouldn't be staying in the building for very long. So you probably find that the rules need to be less strict in those types of apartment buildings because you won't have that problem of long-term systemic bylaw issues that you need to manage. Information about pet limits, cats, and where you can find details. So I included this because of the way you can find details part of the question. So in the building's community management statement, that's where the bylaws live. That document has all of your list of lots that are included in the scheme, the lot entitlements, the bylaws, and any exclusive use areas that apply. Ask your body corporate manager for a copy of that document if you don't have it, and it will detail your pet bylaws. And then separately to that, most local council areas will have this information prominently displayed on their website, and that limit also applies to your body corporate development, depending on what area you're in. Other managers of the complex to have a picture or some sort of identification of pets allocated to the homeowner. So I talked about this in the webinar as an idea. The managers of complexes, so caretakers or on-site managers, they're often not required to do this. It usually wouldn't be in their contract, but this might be a compromise to allow pet processes to be much more smooth and efficient and keep the same level of knowledge about what pets are living in the building. And really that's just so if a pet is roaming around and, you know, it escapes from their front yard, someone can know who it belongs to and return it to their property. So, you know, the pets should be wearing a name tag and a collar at all times to help with the same problem. But a lot of complexes are moving to this disclosure of the pet to the manager scenario rather than asking approval from the committee. Okay, we'll go on now to alterations to the property. So what are the rules and regulations surrounding the installation of security cameras or Ring doorbells, etc., around your unit? So this answer will be quite different if you're in an apartment versus a townhouse. And the difference there is often relating to fire doors and where you're physically installing a Ring doorbell or a security camera. So if you're in a townhouse, you could probably have a security camera on the outside of your townhouse looking at your front yard or backyard. The ruling on that would be based on the visual change to the building. So the committee would usually want to have an approval process to know who's got what cameras, where they're being installed and what they're looking at. That would be something that's more straightforward in a townhouse complex. In an apartment building, if you were to want to have a security camera looking at your front door, you would need to install it probably in a common property hallway, which means you're installing it out in a shared hallway space. That might have some implications for fire systems or other electrical issues out there. And it would be surveilling possibly other people in the common property area as well. So most apartment buildings are much more strict about security cameras and video doorbells than townhouse complexes, but definitely something to talk about at your next AGM or committee meeting. Adding skylights and air conditioners and renovations inside the property. So skylights and air conditioners, obviously two very different things, but what they have in common is some external change to the building. So if you want a skylight, there's got to be an installation on the roof. That roof might be your property in a standard format plan, or it might be common property of the body corporate in a building format plan. So understanding your format plan first and foremost, and then working out what are the impacts visually or on maintenance. If you put a skylight in, will people notice it? Will it be attractive or not? And secondly, if it leaks or is damaged in a hailstorm, then what will happen? So it's two-part question: is are people happy to have this installation based on its looks and its impact? And secondly, what are the conditions that will apply if that thing needs to be maintained or repaired in the future? Same story for air conditioners. I don't really know anybody who's opposed to the idea of air conditioners, full stop. Usually it's just about where's the box, the outside box to be placed, what will be the noise impact, the impact of the air, the hot air blowing out of it, and what will happen when that needs to be repaired or replaced. Internal changes I'll get to on the next slide. Changing the rear courtyard side of the house, gardens, removing shrubs, installing landscaping, slabs, garden sheds, that sort of thing. This sort of assumes that the person is in a townhouse or a freestanding house within a strata development. Those things are based on your bylaws and again, predominantly based on visuals. So most buildings have some type of restriction on any exterior changes, which includes gardens, shrubs, trees, fences and garden sheds, patios, all sorts of things. If it looks different, usually there's a bylaw saying that you can't do it unless you get approval. And again, most committees typically approve most applications, but the process is there to disclose the change to the building as a whole, and also to work out who will be responsible for maintaining that thing in the future so that there's no confusion later on about whether it's a body corporate cost or an owner cost. And the process of asking for approval creates this, paper trail that can be relied on in the future by future owners of your lot if you sell, and future committee members. Interior changes, these are less about the visuals because you can't see them because they're inside. Most interior changes are looking for the structural impact on the building, impact on safety, impact on services. So if you are wanting to, hang a painting on the wall inside your own house, you obviously don't need approval for that. If you wanted to take the wall away completely, the body corporate might have some responsibility to ensure the structural integrity of the building. So even if it's a good idea to make your townhouse more open plan and do a renovation to update and modernize it, the body corporate would still need to ensure that the work is done properly. You've got an engineer to design the beam or to do whatever work needs to be done to make it safe, and you've got to prove all of that to the body corporate community. If you didn't do that and you just went ahead and did some DIY structural renovations and then the building needed to be repaired, that would cause a significant cost to all of the other owners in the complex, and that's why this process exists. So most bylaws have a requirement to seek approval before making any layout changes, because usually to make a layout change, you need to change the location of walls, which is typically structural. They often also restrict any changes to any services, so any plumbing, any electrical, any waterproofing, again, because those things have a greater impact on the building as a whole. Next question asks what things don't require body corporate approval. So wardrobes, curtains, kitchen cabinets, internal walls. This person is just listing examples, but I would say wardrobes, curtain, and kitchen cabinets probably don't need a body corporate approval. If you're keeping the layout of the kitchen the same, you can typically replace it without needing to get approval. Internal wall, if that's being moved or altered in size or position, that would usually require approval. And these conditions are usually more strict in larger apartment building type developments. So if you're in a 20-story building or a building of any size, if you've got units on top of other units and you're moving your kitchen and changing the position of your sink and your dishwasher, that might involve drilling new holes in the floor slab and moving plumbing around, and that might affect the unit below you if there's a leak, or it might affect the fire separation between the unit below and the unit above. So again, most committees approve most changes when it comes to internal and external renovations, but it's about documenting it and working out what are the impacts of this change or the potential impacts of this change on others, and then having a plan and some conditions to minimize any negative impacts. Some more easy examples here. Can I change an internal bedroom door from a hinge to a sliding barn door? That would typically not require body corporate approval because it's not a structural change. It's not something that can be seen, and it doesn't involve changing any other fire services or plumbing. When renovating bathrooms and kitchens, I listed these earlier. Typically, if you're just changing the look of the cabinets, if you're painting the cabinets or taking the doors off and putting new doors on, that would not require approval. If you're moving the position of any of the fixtures, the sinks, the dishwasher, anything that's connected to water or electrical, usually that would trigger a requirement to get approval. Altering the building, for example, the windows are on the outside, so you often have the visual component of will that look good or not, and that's for the building to decide as a whole. And also, if you take an existing window out and put some super duper expensive window in, and then in 10 years time they need to be replaced due to old age or damage, who will pay for the cost of your upgraded window? Will that be your cost or a body corporate cost? So there's two things, there's cost responsibility and then the look of it. Ducted air conditioning, interesting question, because in ceiling spaces, so if you can install ducted air conditioning, it means you've got a space between your white plasterboard ceiling and whatever is above that. So it might be the roof of the building, or it might be the slab of the unit upstairs. So if there's a cavity there, that's typically body corporate area. So if you're installing the ducted air conditioning stuff in that area, you're actually installing it in a common property zone. It doesn't change the look of that zone because you can't see it, but if the body corporate had to do some work and it had to remove your air conditioning and put it back in, who would pay for the cost of that? So again, usually approved, but with conditions. Are there price limits to internal renovations regarding notifying body corporate? No, there are no price limits. So this is important because some work that people do is really significant but not expensive. So moving the sink in your kitchen and drilling a new hole in the floor to put the plumbing through is not going to be expensive, but would have a big impact on the floor slab if you accidentally drilled through a pipe or drilled through some structural reinforcing to put your kitchen sink in a new position. So it's not about the cost of the work, but obviously as the cost gets higher and higher, the chance that you are doing something significant is also higher. A lot of things that people do in their units are expensive, but people don't need to know. So if you wanted to do a full interior repaint and replace your carpet with new carpet, that might be quite expensive, but the body corporate usually wouldn't need to know about that. In some cases, some buildings have specific bylaws for those things, but usually it's just the structural changes and the services changes, regardless of what those cost. Next question is, can a lot owner change flooring in their townhouse from carpet to laminate without body corporate approval? This person has a neighbour who's changed their carpet to laminate and can now hear them walking around because it's obviously changed the sound profile. In my experience, most apartment buildings, so high rises and units with other units above and below them, they usually have a flooring bylaw because your one man's floor is the next man's ceiling. In that case, usually any change from carpet to a hard flooring type would need to be approved and meet a specific sound rating. Most townhouses don't have that bylaw because no one is underneath your townhouse. But in this case, it's interesting because these two examples obviously have a shared wall and you can hear from one to the other people walking around. So there may not be a bylaw about this particular unit example, but might be a good idea to add a bylaw if this has caused a problem. If there is a problem with this example and there is no bylaw to address it, it still may be captured under a noise nuisance bylaw, depending on how much of a nuisance it's causing to the neighbour. Moving on to water billing now. So interested to hear the pros and cons of individual versus bulk water billing. On our website, we have a really detailed article about individual water meters in body corporate properties. Very quick summary of that. It's nearly always better to have individual water billing because it's fairer, people pay for what they use, and there's no arguments about who's got more residents or who has longer showers. So individual water meters are always better, but if you don't have them already, the cost of installing them is usually very significant. So it's not about, is the individual billing a good thing or not? It's, are we prepared to pay, you know, $2,000 per unit to install individual meters when that may not, we may not actually get our money back for, you know, 10 or 20 years, depending on how much water you use. So it's not, this person's asked the question. I don't think anybody's arguing that bulk billing is the best way to do it. It's just the way that these older buildings in particular have been set up. And there's a really high cost to change them to individual water billing. What can be done about water hammer in an old complex? This happens a fair bit. This is where you turn off taps and you get that banging sound. I'm sure it can be solved. Pretty much all problems in buildings can be solved. It's just a matter of at what cost. So if you've got a building where this is bothering residents and residents are prepared to pay, you know, a special levy to investigate and repair it, that would usually involve taking away the walls to access the pipes and then putting the walls back. That's why it would be an expensive job, but everything's possible, and it's a matter of, are the residents prepared to invest either their sinking fund or their own money into fixing that problem. What are the rules for water bills? I'm single and I pay $400 every 3 months. That is terrible. That $400 every 3 months is not out of the ballpark. I've got another question about this as well, but it's the water bills that residents pay all throughout Queensland involve a couple of components. There's a water access charge, there's a sewer access charge, and then there's the actual water consumption that you use, number of litres used. You pay for that as a third thing. So even if you don't use much water, you still pay for the water access charge and the sewer access charge. And the water is actually the smallest part of most bills. So when you get water meters and your consumption goes up and down, it's not that your whole bill goes up and down, only a small portion of it does. And then last question on the slide, this person's not been in the unit for the last 5.5 months, however, still gets a bill for $256. That will be the water and the sewer access charges. And you can't get out of those. They're a requirement from, either Queensland Urban Utilities or your local council. If your property is connected to the water and the sewer, you've got to pay those charges, even if your property is empty. So the base load cost for a normal property is around $1,000 per year, just for the water and sewer access charges. Okay, parking and vehicles. Can a body corporate convert common space to car parks without consulting the owner's neighbours to the common space? A body corporate usually can't create additional car parking without a town planning approval. So I talked about this a little bit in the webinar. It is not a requirement to consult with every owner. So if the body corporate did have a development approval to install, 4 additional car parks, maybe turn an area of garden bed into some additional parking, as long as the body corporate made that decision using the correct meeting procedure, it does not need to go and individually consult with the residents who are directly next to that area. So if you're an owner in a body corporate, it is important to look at your AGM or EGM agendas and read the minutes to see what is going on. Usually you do not have a right to have someone come and directly approach you about topics. It's up to each owner to read the information that is given to them and then make a decision based on that information. So there's nothing special. Just because you're the most affected by a particular change does not mean someone will come and consult you on it. You will just be consulted with all other owners through the AGM. Reallocation of visitor car parks to units, is this allowed? Usually no, because the visitor car parking is required by council, and usually buildings only have the minimum number of spaces already. So if you take 1 visitor car park and you give it to unit 5, then you're down a visitor car park, which would typically breach the council's rules. Can a driveway be an allocated car park if it's the only access? Yes, it can. So some townhouses in particular, to get to the front door, you've got to walk up the driveway. Some don't have their own front garden path. That doesn't mean that the driveway can't be used for parking. It's up to the body corporate to make that decision when it's looking at where the parking is permitted in the scheme. Why are certain vehicle types not allowed to be parked in allocated parking spaces? So some buildings will have bylaws to say parking should only be for cars or motorbikes, and you can't park boats and camper vans and jet skis and other things like that in the car parking space. Some of that is related to the look of the thing. So if you had spaces which were visible, a lot of buildings don't want people parking things like camper vans in front of their houses. And that's just to maintain the beauty of the complex as a whole. It doesn't mean it's the only way to do it, but a lot of these body corporate bylaws have that in there almost as a default. In other cases, there might be a design reason why people can't park certain vehicles in their car space. So if you've got an apartment building with a tight entryway, often they will have bylaws that say no trailers, because trailers can get stuck in the entryway, or if you've got to go through a boom gate or something like that, or if the building just wasn't designed to have big vehicles fit in it, or another case I'm aware of, the building was designed in a certain way with fire systems, and council said you can't park anything in here that's not a car, because cars are designed, they're manufactured professionally and they typically don't catch on fire very often. And some other vehicles might change the fire system operation. If you parked, a jet ski in there and it was running to clear it out after you'd used it, that would be something that might not be permitted by the council rules. So some buildings have really specific bylaws for that reason, but usually there's minimal restriction on types of vehicles. Parking, what is meant by exclusive use? So exclusive use, whenever you see this in body corporate, means the parcel of land is owned by the body corporate and it's given to an individual owner to use exclusively. So that's exclusive use of common property. A lot of parking, if you're talking about basements of buildings or parking on driveways in front of townhouses, that's often done using exclusive use. So the land is still owned and controlled by the body corporate, but Unit 5 has the exclusive use right to park their car on that land. That granting of exclusive use needs to go through to an AGM or an EGM, and it has a really high threshold. So it's a resolution without dissent, meaning if you've got a building with 50 lot owners, if any one of those owners votes no, that motion will be defeated. So it's a really high threshold. It's almost as good as owning the space in terms of security. So it can't be taken away from you unless you agree, but it's technically owned by the body corporate, and that gives the body corporate some more power about how it makes rules about that area. A body corporate cannot allocate a car park for a set period. If it makes an allocation of exclusive use, that is permanent or based on a certain specific time frame, which would be, someone has exclusive use for a period of 12 months, and then the exclusive use will end. And to do it again or to give it to somebody else after that, you would need that new resolution and you'd need everybody to agree. So because it has a very high threshold, it's typically something which is done permanently only. What about residents who think parking bylaws don't apply overnight and fill up all the visitor spaces? Do complexes usually tolerate this? A lot of the time complexes do tolerate it. That is not the right answer, but sometimes it occurs, and if the complex as a whole is comfortable with that occurring, often it doesn't get enforced very actively. But technically, a visitor space is required to be empty 24/7 for visitors. You might not have visitors at night, but that does not mean your neighbours won't have visitors at night. And might be the case that your neighbour has a carer or somebody coming to their property at all times of the day and night and requires access to visitor car parking spaces. So if the local council found out about this, they would certainly have an issue with it. But in practice, and depending on the size of your complex and how many visitor car parking spaces are available, it is something that occurs frequently, and it is difficult for committees to manage it. Some committees have thought it's a losing battle to manage this, so we will turn a blind eye to it, but that's not the right answer. The right answer is that committees should enforce bylaws 24/7, including if residents come home from work and park in the visitor spaces. Those residents ought to know better, and they are not visitors. Households with 2 or more cars, where can they park? That is not a problem that the body corporate can help those people with. If there is not enough car parking for that person and their number of vehicles, that is for the individual to resolve. So the answer is not you park in the garden or you park in front of someone else's driveway or you park in the pool area. If you are purchasing or renting a property and it only has 1 car parking space and you've got 2 cars or 5 cars, you would have to work out where to put those, and it can't be anywhere on the scheme land. It has to be out on the road, or you put them in storage, or you share cars and sell one, or you might agree to park your car in someone else's garage if they're not using their garage. So this is not a problem that the body corporate is able to solve. And if this is a response that your committee gets when they try and enforce a bylaw, then the committee needs to be strong and not take this into account, because it's the number of car parks in a building it doesn't change, and nobody should be surprised by it. So if you're buying or renting, this should be a key consideration for you. Is there any responsibility for body corporate to install an electric car charger? No, bodies corporate will not be required to install electric car chargers in the foreseeable future. Owners may make applications to install their own electric car chargers, and the body corporate has an obligation to consider their request. But the body corporate doesn't have a responsibility to install a car charger for shared use of residents. If an owner applied to install their own car charger in their garage or in their parking space, the body corporate would need to consider its impact on the building and on other residents and make a reasonable decision based on those factors. Can a driveway into a garage be allocated as my unit's visitor car park? So if you've got a driveway, if you've got a garage with a driveway in front of it and a car can fit on that driveway and it's not blocking anybody else, a lot of buildings allocate that area to each garage area as exclusive use. So you obviously wouldn't want someone else parking in front of your garage unless they were your own visitor or your own, spare car. But if you park in front of your garage, it's not really affecting anybody else, as long as your car fits on there completely and doesn't poke out into the common area road. So this is something buildings often do. They say everybody can have the exclusive use of the driveway directly in front of their garage. Your car must fit on it, it can't poke out, and it can't obstruct anybody else. And that wouldn't be a visitor car park, that would just be an extra car park for each lot. Going on to insurance now. What items inside the individual units are covered by the building strata insurance policy? So strata insurance is very specific. So this answer is very generalized. But if your particular body corporate does provide insurance for the buildings, that usually covers fixed items such as kitchens, shower screens, toilets, tiles, and anything that's permanently attached and part of the building. It usually doesn't cover any floating floors, carpets, curtains, and blinds. Those are considered furnishing items. But importantly, some strata complexes don't provide building insurance, depending on how they're developed originally. So if this is a question that you're asking yourself, you should refer to the individual strata insurance policy for your building and ask for some specific advice. Next question, has there been a search for insurance this year? This is obviously a person asking a specific question, but as a rule, yes, the body corporate, at least if BC Systems is your manager, we go to the insurance market every year for every building and provide the quotations to the committee. So usually the current insurer will be the cheapest on renewal or the most suitable on renewal. So it's fairly rare that buildings will change insurers every year. Usually an insurer would become a good option for you and you'd stay with them for a couple of years, and then something might change which changes the pricing structure. But every year we go to market to obtain quotations for our clients, and some buildings only are able to get a quotation from their current insurer if they've had a lot of claims or if they've got some defects in the building. Usually new insurers won't quote until those issues are resolved. So sometimes you still only have one option, but the search occurs for every building every year for BC Systems customers. Our website could provide a brief description of body corporate insurance coverage. It actually does that under the FAQ section of our BC Systems website. Again, it's general in nature because we can't give specific insurance advice on our website, but each owner also has access to the certificate of insurance. It's in your AGM every year. So if you look back at your last AGM agenda, it will have a brief summary of the body corporate insurance coverage in the motion, and it will also attach the insurance certificate. That might not answer your specific question, but it will at least give you the name of the insurer, what the claim limits are, and enough information for you to ask a follow-up question. Okay, how do I make a building insurance claim? I understand that body corporate insurance covers the building. So if you've got a property that's managed by BC Systems, we have a claim form on our website, an insurance claim form. you don't make the claim to us because we're not your insurer, but we help owners to make insurance claims. So you send us the claim form. We sort of help ask you the right questions so that we get the right information that we need in order to lodge the claim on your behalf. And then we assist you in that process. So if the insurer asks specific questions about whether the body corporate is registered for GST or when certain reports were undertaken, we know that information and we add that into your claim to make that run smoothly for you. So I would say if you're in the first stages of how to make an insurance claim, if you're a BC Systems client, go on our website to the insurance claim form and it will give you some guidance and also ask you questions. So onto financials and levies now. So first question on this list, what is included within my quarterly bill and what services are provided? What can be used with this payment? We've got on our website a guide to body corporate budgets and levies, which is a great starting place. If your questions are of this initial knowledge gathering type of question, I would say have a look at that dashboard on financials and levies, which is under our main website navigation. But basically, the body corporate collects money to pay expenses. So it's not a service that the body corporate is providing to residents. It is the collection of funds so that the body corporate can maintain the common property and provide services to the building. So pay for the common area electricity, pay for the pool servicing, pay for the gardener. So all those costs are what owners are paying via their quarterly levies. It doesn't entitle owners to get a service from the body corporate. You are actually just paying the body corporate's costs. Why do different units pay different amounts of levies? So again, this is dealt with in our in-depth article, but generally the units have different numbers of entitlements. So very basic overview, larger units would typically pay more in levies. They use more of the body corporate services, things like painting and roof repairs, so they pay a slightly higher proportion. And then the insurance levy is calculated based on the value of the building. So sometimes there can be a difference in the insurance levy component of the overall levies as well between different units in the same scheme. I've got a couple of questions here that I've lumped together of please provide the breakdown of costs and why are my levies this price instead of that price and why the fee is expensive. So body corporate levies, there's no profit component. So if your levies are higher than the building next door, then your building is spending more than the building next door. That might be a range of factors contributing to that. It might have different insurance history. It might have had more claims or have not been constructed as well. Therefore, more roof leaks or more underpinning problems, which pushes up your cost of insurance, plus the cost of repairing those problems. Your building may have had historically lower levies, which means it hasn't saved up the same amount of money over the history of the building. So now to meet the new costs, it needs to raise money more quickly and put levies up. So there's no ability to compare levies between one building or another because the buildings are totally unique. They have different numbers of lots in them, which means the calculations are based on how many units are in each building. And also the history of those buildings is also a very relevant factor. So in theory, if you had two buildings that were exactly the same, built on the same day by the same person, and they had the same number of maintenance issues and the same electricity, same number of light bulbs and pool pumps, then they would have the same levies, but that's not reality. And so over time, as different buildings make different decisions, their cost profiles change. But every body corporate in Queensland is only paying the amount that it needs to pay because no one is making a profit on levies, and the incentive is to set them at the minimum possible rate to run the building. Owners do have access to see all body corporate fees. So every year as an owner, you'll receive the levy budgets in your AGM agenda. You get a copy of what your levies will be. So, you know, a certain number of dollars per quarter, but you also see the budget that goes into that. So you'll see how much the body corporate's spending in total and what it's spending the money on. So everybody has access to that. That's how those fees are calculated. Owners can also see what other owners have paid and who is in arrears. So if a lot owner hasn't paid their body corporate levies and has levy arrears, the body corporate will pursue that owner to get their money in. It's required to do that under the law so that the system is fair. So if that occurs, owners are disclosed, lot 10 owes $10,000 and is being sent to debt collection. That type of information is not secret. All owners are affected by financial decisions, so they all are informed about those things. The balance required for sinking funds. This is a hot topic at the moment because inflation is so high. So if you had a building that spent $150,000 on painting, 5 years ago, and it needed to paint again, that project might cost $300,000 now. So if you're saving for projects in your sinking fund, you're saving based on an estimated cost of a project. And as inflation impacts the cost of building materials and steel and paint and everything, those projects will be more expensive than probably what you anticipated they would be, which means the amount of money you need in the sinking fund is constantly increasing to keep up. So there's no one balance required for a sinking fund. It does depend on how many lots you've got, what you've got in the building that will need repair, and then what your current balance is. So if you've had a great run of the last 5 years, you haven't really needed to spend much because everything's worked correctly and you haven't had any surprises, you're going to be in a better position than a building which had a big storm and had to fix roofs and had to, fix the driveway before it thought it needed to. That building would have spent more money out of the fund than it anticipated and would therefore have less remaining funds. So that is assessed every 5 years by a quantity surveyor. We don't decide what you need in your sinking fund. It is done by an expert engaged by your body corporate, and they set those levies, and then the body corporate just brings in that money and puts it in the savings account. And I threw this last question in here just for a bit of contrast. So a lot of these people are saying why the fee is expensive and, who sets our levies. Another person in the same webinar said they want to add a common area swimming pool. So, that's possible too. Buildings can decide what they do to the common property. Obviously, that type of thing would need to go to a vote of owners and would increase the cost. So if you don't have a pool now and you put a pool in, A, you've got to pay for the installation of it, and B, you've got to maintain it forever. So that sort of thing would bring cost and increase levies in that building. And what you get for those increased levies is the ability to swim in a pool. So that's the decision that those people in that building would be asked to make by this lot owner who has had this idea. So for everybody who thinks the building should cut services and reduce costs, there are people who might think the building should increase services and increase cost. And that's why you've got a committee system where not one person is making the decisions. You have a group of people, all of the owners in the building, they get together, they brainstorm ideas, and they work out what's the best thing for our building this year, and then we set the levies accordingly. Some general management questions now. So who decides on when the AGM will be held? Is it the body corporate manager or the committee? That part of the question, the AGM has to be held at a certain time frame under the law. So every body corporate has a financial year end date. It's the end of a certain month. Every building has a different date. So every month, a number of buildings have their end of year process. So for all Australians, it's 30 June. That's when our tax year changes over. But for body corporate, it might be the 31st of May or the 30th of November. It can be any month. And then the AGM is held 3 months after that date. So we will work with the committee to decide the exact day which suits people's calendars, but it has to be held at a certain time frame based on the law. The next part of the question, who gets the quotes for suppliers? That's the committee's responsibility. Often the committee asks us to assist with getting quotes depending on what it is that needs to be quoted, or if your body corporate has a caretaker contractor or an on-site manager, usually the quote part of projects is delegated to that person. But someone's got to get the quote, so it doesn't really matter who does it, depending on what the quote is for. If someone's got an area of expertise in that field or some experience or knows good contractors, they usually take the lead on getting the quotes. When a committee fails to comply as per registered bylaws, what is the role and responsibility of the strata manager? So this is an interesting question because the bylaws don't apply to the committee. They certainly apply to committee members. So if you're the committee chairperson, you still have to do the right thing and follow the rules just like everybody else. But the bylaws don't control how the committee functions as a group. The committee does have to follow certain parts of the legislation. So that decides how often they can meet and how much notice they need to give people. You know, they need to produce minutes of the meetings. They have 6 weeks to decide applications. So there's a whole lot of regulation about how the committee operates, but the bylaws don't serve that function. So the strata manager, so BC Systems in this example, doesn't enforce bylaws against the committee. If the committee does the wrong thing, we will point out to them, you know, you've done the wrong thing here, committee. This is how you can correct it. This is what the rules say. This is why the rule exists. And often that's a common sense issue where, you know, someone just missed an element of the decision and we've corrected it and there's been no harm. But if a committee member or a group of committee members is actively breaching bylaws, the strata manager can't enforce the bylaws. The only person who can enforce the bylaws is the committee. So if you've got committee members who are breaching the bylaws, the owners in that building should decide whether those are the appropriate committee members. Remember that the committee members are elected every year by the owners. So if you have a committee member who isn't doing the job properly, owners do not need to elect that person to the committee, and there is a mechanism to recall or remove committee members from the committee throughout the year, which is used if the committee member's conduct is really seriously a problem. Can a manager who has purchased the rights to manage the complex be dismissed for lack of performance? So this is now talking about not body corporate managers like BC Systems. This is talking about caretaking contractors or on-site managers. They purchase the management business and they do the rentals and the caretaking services on site. As a contractor, yes, they can be dismissed for lack of performance. All contractors can generally be dismissed if they're not performing. The question here is, are they performing or not? And is it a unified view that they are not performing, or in what areas are they not performing? So it's not the same as having an employee, but it's similar. So if you've got someone who, you know, if you either are an employee or you are an employer, you would know that you can't just be, you know, fired on the spot for doing one thing incorrectly. You do have rights to have a process that protects your rights as a worker and also balances the employer's rights. So in this caretaker body corporate arrangement, the body corporate is the group that employs or contracts with the caretaker. The body corporate does have rights, but it can't just terminate the contract over a simple performance issue. It can raise that performance issue with the caretaker or the contractor, and if that issue is not resolved, then a pathway becomes available to go through a breach notice and a potential termination. It's very uncommon for management rights to be terminated because most of us, if you're doing something at work and you're not doing it well, and you get told about it, you change your behavior and you improve in that area. And that means, you keep your job and everything goes back to normal. So there is a process, but it is not an easy process for either party, and the breach of the contract or the lack of performance needs to be quite significant before any agreement could be terminated. We're under an accommodation module. Can the on-site manager keep asking for top-ups after the 25-year contract and also ask to live off-site? So again, this is talking about caretaking service contractors or on-site managers. Under the accommodation module, there is a 25-year limit to the length of the contract with the caretaker. That 25 years is from today. It's not from when it originally started. So what happens is contractors enter into 25-year agreements, and after 5 years, 5 years has been used up, so it's down to 20, and then they can add another 5 years at the end. That adding additional time requires the body corporate's approval. It's not automatic. So the body corporate can be asked the question by the caretaker, do you agree to extend my contract by 5 years? And owners can vote yes or no. The same thing with the contractor asking to live off-site. That's just a simple variation to what their contract says. It's a contract between two parties, the body corporate and the caretaker. And so to make changes to that contract, both parties need to agree. And the caretaker can ask the body corporate to consider agreeing to certain changes, and you'll see those motions come through from time to time in your AGM. By law, how long does a body corporate have to repair damage to the outside of the property? Is it the strata's responsibility to manage this? So the last part of the question first, the strata and the body corporate is the same thing. So the body corporate means all owners. Body corporate manager, so our job as BC Systems, we don't manage the responsibilities of the body corporate. We certainly work with the committee to point out, their responsibilities and help them. But if a body corporate becomes aware of damage to the outside of the property and it's the body corporate's responsibility to fix that thing, then the body corporate does have an obligation to fix it. There is no time limit on that. It has to act reasonably when it makes those decisions. So if you had a roof leak and it was a body corporate roof leak, and the body corporate asked for 25 different quotes to look at to make a decision, that would probably be an unreasonable decision. And you could say, look, it's a simple issue. I can see how it needs to be repaired. It's causing damage to my lot, and you should maybe get 1 or 2 quotes and just get it done. And so you'd use some common sense there. If it was a much more substantial problem that took a long time or was complicated in order to repair, that time frame would be longer. But so there's no one answer for that. It's about, is the body corporate committee and the owners working on this problem, or are they going too slow, and is that slowness unreasonable? Or are they going slow because it's a really hard problem to fix and it takes a lot of different consultants, and it might need an engineer and a town planner to work out how to fix it. In that case, some things just do take a long time. So our job is not to set the limits, it's to work with the body corporate to try and make sure that the decisions that they're making are reasonable, 1, and 2, in the best interest of the body corporate long term. Sometimes it's better to do a 90% good job today rather than wait 6 months and do a 100% good job. So it depends on what the problem is, but that's one of the challenges of being on a committee, is to make those decisions. Someone said, what can we do to reduce the cost and utilize unoccupied land around in strata? So if you've got, this is a question that doesn't come up very often, but if you've got a body corporate with a large area of land attached to it, so it might be like just a big grassy area or something, bodies corporate can sell land that they own. So if you had, if you have a Queenslander as a house and you have a really big block, you could subdivide it and sell half to a developer. A body corporate can do the same thing, as long as it has enough land and the land is zoned appropriately. So it doesn't happen very often, but bodies corporate can develop their own land. So I suggest if this person has a question about that in their own scheme, they give us a call, because it might be that that area is needed as part of the scheme for a certain reason, but otherwise it might be an idea that the building could look at exploring. Obviously, if you're selling property as a body corporate, that would need to go to all owners to agree on, because all owners own that land, but it is certainly possible. And last page of questions now. So these came through our Ask the Expert platform on our website. A small complex has a perimeter boundary fence running the full length of the property on both sides, as well as a back fence separating the neighbouring complex. If part of the main fence surrounding the complex is in a section marked as exclusive use, is it that unit owner's responsibility to maintain? Or seeing it is the main fence surrounding the whole property, is it the body corporate responsibility? So general rule for fencing, if it's the outside perimeter fence of the whole area of your development, that is a common property fence. So the body corporate pays for their half, and whoever's on the other side of that fence, so it might be another different body corporate, or it might be a house or a school or something, they pay for their 50% based on sections. So fences between two units in the same body corporate, usually 50-50, but if it's a main perimeter fence around the whole outside of your body corporate, that will also be certain units back fences, but because it's the main fence, it's a body corporate responsibility. Next one, historically, how accurate has the sinking fund projection been to the actual funds required? So sinking fund forecasts are usually fairly accurate. Whether the body corporate sticks to it or not is another question. So they're prepared by quantity surveyors who, I mean, they do a better job of estimating costs than I would do. I wouldn't know where to start to estimate costs. I would just look at what other buildings have done and work from there. But quantity surveyors usually have a good knowledge of the construction of buildings, how much painting costs per square meter, those sorts of industry price rates. So they are reasonably accurate. The best sinking fund forecast involves the committee participating in it. So if you've got a sinking fund forecast that's due to be reviewed and the inspector comes out to look, I would suggest the committee meet that person and talk about what's going on in the building, what are their priorities, and help plan out what the next couple of years maintenance will look like. So it's usually not the accuracy of the report and the details in the report, it's that the report doesn't match up with what the owners want to do. So if the report says you should paint your building in 2024, but owners think it looks fantastic and doesn't need to be painted until 2027, that will change the price of that painting, because if you do it 3 or 4 years later, it will be more expensive. So the cost of the work will be wrong. And also the time impact of that. If you're spending money next year, you need to raise it now. If you're spending it in 4 years' time, you've got 4 years to save up for it. So something like that can have a huge impact on the levies. It doesn't mean the report was wrong, it just wasn't what the owners want to do. So that's why getting the owners involved in that process, or committee members representing the owners, means you're getting the most bang for your buck in those reports. Have you ever had a surplus of funds as projected? No, not in my experience. Sinking funds are the bare minimum spending for the building. They don't include upgrades. They don't include any unexpected damage. So if someone crashes into your building and for some reason you can't claim it on insurance, you could pay that repair out of the sinking fund, but that's eating into your savings. So at the end of the year, you would have less in the fund than what you thought. So it's very, very rare that a building would have a surplus of sinking funds. Usually the building spends more than what the bare minimum maintenance requirement is. This person's also asked if the projected amount of maintenance will plateau, or will the amount of maintenance continue to rise as the building gets older? I think it's just common sense that maintenance typically increases with the age of the building. Individual items will certainly have these plateau periods. So if you are having a series of roof leaks because the roof is 20 years old and you bite the bullet and replace the whole roof, you know, the year or two after that, you should expect no roof leaks. But in order to get there, you've got to replace the roof, and that would be a really significant project. And at the same time, you might solve the roof leak problem, but now your driveway is starting to crack. So I think there's always going to be increasing maintenance as buildings get older. They generally do not get lower maintenance. And then what is the life expectancy of a building? This is an issue that we haven't really had to deal with in Queensland. It's very rare that buildings meet their end of life and get demolished. But, you know, buildings don't last forever. So yes, I don't know the answer to that question, but it is a worthwhile question to ask. You know, is it reasonable to expect buildings to just last forever? Or at some stage, do you say, look, you know, this building is now 75 years old and it's costing more to repair than it is worth? Just like if you have an old car and it's breaking down a lot, and, you know, at some stage you've got to send it to the scrapyard and go and buy a new one. So there is going to be some work needed on this as the age of the buildings in our state gets longer and longer. We'll need to work out a plan to deal with some of the end of life issues for these buildings. And last question, thought I'd end on an interesting one. Would smoke drift from a meat smoker be treated the same way as cigarette smoke? Our neighbour's meat smoker is proving to be a nuisance with smoke drift. One night, the smoke drift from their meat smoker set off our smoke alarms, and it can be in use for up to 8 to 12 hours. So I've never had this question before, but it's a really good question. The way I would think about this is that the risk of hazard from smoke is the smoke itself. So it's not that cigarette smoke is bad for you and wood smoke is good for you. I think wood smoke is also bad for you. There may be a difference in how bad for you it is, but I think that it makes sense that the same rules for cigarette smoke would apply to meat smoke, which is just wood smoke, or a fireplace, or someone, you know, having a bonfire in their backyard. So any type of smoke, or, you know, car exhaust or something, if there was a type of smoke that's causing a nuisance or a hazard, no matter what that smoke is coming from, I think the rules would be either the same or pretty close. And if it set off the smoke alarms of a internal unit, it's obviously in the air and quite a significant amount of smoke. I've not heard of cigarette smoke setting off fire alarms before. So if this smoke is setting off smoke alarms, it's obviously a fair amount of smoke, probably not good for a person's health to be breathing that in. And it is something I think the body corporate could regulate using bylaws. And it might be the same as smoking. The outcome is the person needs to move that meat smoker, you know, further away from the building, or limit its use, or put it next to a big fan. I don't know what the outcome would be, but you know, this is an example of where bylaws designed for one thing might actually apply to a different thing altogether. And maybe you should invite that person over for a barbecue and they can bring their smoked meat and you can talk about a negotiated solution rather than going off to an adjudication. So that's all we've got time for today in questions and answers. Appreciate everybody's time putting those together. We're always happy to answer questions. We did get a number of questions come through that were very, very specific about that person's building. So we haven't shared those today because they're not suitable for the group. So if you did ask a question and I haven't answered it, please get in touch with your strata manager at BC Systems so we can give you specific advice about your question based on your building. And as always, if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out and get in touch with me or the team, and we're always happy to assist. And otherwise, thanks for joining.